Yeah, it's a worrying situation, isn't it? So let's get more reaction on this story. I'm joined via Zoom by Karam Singh, who is head of legal and investigations for Corruption Watch. Karam, you were able to listen to that interview. It's very concerning, and it's a good point that has been raised by Athol, and it's basically regarding he has received warnings but not death threats, and he brings up the Babita Deokaran incident where there were no death threats but she was killed. So when do authorities need to intervene and actually ensure the safety of whistleblowers?
Well, it's a very difficult question, and we're dealing with a massive corruption problem which goes beyond the confines of the Zondo Commission. There are any number of whistleblowers out there who find themselves in very vulnerable situations. Some of whom who have only gone to their employers or haven't necessarily been outed publicly as whistleblowers. So I think we have an issue around the general culture. I think Athol's pointed to this issue when he talks about the need for support and the need for protection. At the moment, we clearly identified the need for whistleblowing. President Ramaphosa was so clear in his closing remarks at the Zondo Commission on the centrality that whistleblowers play in the fight against corruption. If it's not for people on the inside disclosing information, much of what happens doesn't get revealed. So if we work from the premise that we can't fight corruption without whistleblowers, then we need to really give much more attention to thinking about how we can build a much broader kind of base of support around whistleblowers. This is support which is about psychosocial support, it's about legal support, it's about financial support, and it's about safety and security. When Athol says he's not comfortable going to the police because he doesn't trust the police, I think that would probably be a sentiment that would be shared broadly by many people in the country. So, if that lack of fundamental trust in approaching the law authorities isn't in place, then we really are dealing with an uphill type of battle.
Yeah. You mentioned that we need to do this, that, and whatever to ensure the safety of whistleblowers. So what's happening then with the Protection Disclosure Act? In its current form, in terms of implementation, is it useless?
I wouldn't say it's useless. It does provide a framework, and it does provide the base of a kind of legal protection. The problem is that there isn't anybody who's really appears to be responsible for implementing that act. So, for instance, there's an obligation upon employers to have a kind of whistleblowing policy in place, a whistleblowing policy which is clear and understood by its employees. Who's monitoring that? Who's holding companies to account that they have an appropriate whistleblowing policy in place? We have something called occupational detriment. So if you blow the whistle, you can't be subjected to occupational detriment. But we know that this still happens to whistleblowers over and over again. So they find themselves with mounting legal costs, actions at the CCMA, and there isn't a legal culture around them to say that in this situation they can then actually be offensive and go after those who are victimizing them so that they can be compensated. So it is fundamental. It's fundamentally not just about the law, but it's about the entire kind of social structure around the law that's failing us. The law alone, in and of itself, is fine. It's a framework. It's a baseline. But we know that our corruption problem is much higher, so we've got to go beyond that.
Yeah, it's so worrying that you actually have to say that, and it obviously will lead to some people not coming forward because we're seeing all of this play out in the media. And I've heard from so many experts, including what the president had to say at the Zondo Commission, that whistleblowing is one of the greatest forms to fighting corruption in South Africa, yet this piece of legislation is not really protecting these whistleblowers. Athol Williams also said to Sally a short while ago that he didn't know who to turn to, from NGOs to private companies and ultimately law enforcement. Who do whistleblowers actually turn to? What's your advice in that regard?
It really depends. Corruption Watch, we put ourselves out there as being able to receive complaints from the public, but we don't have a a deep investigative forensic capacity to do investigations. We don't have a mandate to do investigations. So we do what we can to work with whistleblowers to try to help them, and where possible, direct them in the right place. We have a special investigating unit which has a deep forensic capacity. I know that they deal with whistleblowers. We have the Hawks and the DPCI, which has revived itself to a certain extent. But it's, you know, in terms of people out there in rural areas, in municipalities where they see things that are going wrong, it's not easy. There's no easy answer to say, go to your police station and level a complaint. Use the Harassment Act to get a protection order against being harassed. It's a very, very challenging system. We need to match up a system which can support whistleblowers to the rhetoric that the president gave when he spoke at Zondo. So, you know, Willie Hofmeyr and others have spoken about creating some kind of a whistleblower office within the state, an ombud person for whistleblowing. We know that there are such offices in other jurisdictions like in Holland. So, I mean, I think possibly we need an institutional response to this as well, that provides a place within the state where whistleblowers feel safe and where they can go to, because at the moment that doesn't exist.
Yeah, sadly, right? So right now, you know, very quickly, tell me, if somebody has information and they're thinking about being a whistleblower, is there anything that they can do to protect themselves when they come out with this information?
Well, I mean, you obviously have to be very guarded about your identity. You have to ensure that the people that you're bringing the information to are people that you can trust and support. I mean, it is difficult for us in civil society to deal with anonymous complaints because it's difficult to then follow these things up and get the information required. But certainly, you know, there are trusted bodies out there. I'd like to think Corruption Watch is one of them. You know, there are others in civil society. But it really depends on the issues that you're dealing with. And, you know, whistleblowers have to watch their back. And in some cases, they have to remain anonymous in order to protect themselves.
All right. Thank you so much for your insight and your time. Appreciate it. Karam Singh, Head of Legal and Investigations for Corruption Watch.
Yeah, you know, it is really worrying because, as William says, I haven't had a death threat, but I know people would want me dead. And what do? Do you wait until you've got all those death threats and you've got proof? Because if someone is really serious about taking you out, they probably wouldn't warn you necessarily.
Yeah, exactly.
Because he's already given out that information. And it's really very distressing to hear how very little support there seems to be. There aren't formal systems in place and a process in place.
I mean, you can't just watch your back. It's not as easy to do, right?